By far, the most decisive fundamental of leftist ideology is egalitarianism. It informs almost everything they believe: how society should be structured, how persons and races should be treated, how we assign duties and rights, and the parameters that determine when those who violate those rights should be punished. But it's astonishing how seldom leftists actually justify this point of view. If egalitarianism were philosophically demolished, it would destroy practically the entire leftist worldview. And fortunately for the right, egalitarianism is actually a critical weakness. We might already note, for example, the fact that no biological study has ever found a scientific basis for human egalitarianism. Humans all have a high degree of variance in the brain and in the body, even between the sexes. That fact alone, however, only invalidates half of the principle: factual egalitarianism. There remains the belief in normative or ethical egalitarianism, which could potentially be sustained even if humans were intrinsically different in their immutable traits. Liberals have tried to construct a normative basis for egalitarianism, but for various reasons, I believe that their project has been a failure. One of the strongest is that of John Rawls, but I've already made a video critiquing his theory of justice. I've also gone over, elsewhere, Evola's critique of individualism, and if individualism falls, the normative egalitarianism mostly goes with it. There are, however, additional arguments we might be able to make against this concept. First, we will start with the postmodern view that all points of view are equally valid. If this is true, then one cannot ever have any sort of debate regarding values, as each value perspective is equally valid, and its difference vis-a-vis another value perspective cannot ever be the basis of disapproval. I don't actually find that leftists usually hold this specific view, as they obviously think Marxism or socialism is a superior point of view to capitalism or fascism, and generally I don't think that most leftists would describe themselves as postmodernists. Rather, they seem to mostly hold modernist views while taking inspiration from postmodernists in regard to power analysis and deconstruction, rather than ethics or epistemology. To say that there is such a thing as a definitive postmodernist is itself questionable. For example, I have taken a lot of inspiration from Michel Foucault, despite holding basically a pre-modern perspective on philosophy and ethics. Simply because someone takes inspiration from postmodernists doesn't mean they necessarily accept full relativism. Rather, I think the left is only relativistic on certain questions. We might accuse them of inconsistency or tactical relativism, such as on the problem of the origins of homosexuality, whether people are born that way or whether it's caused by social factors, but that's another issue. Regardless, I figured I had to get this problem out of the way before we continue. Next, we have to consider equal rights. We can take for granted that all people exhibit a values hierarchy. We all value some things more or less than others. For example, we might value compassion more than severity, or peace more than violence. Egalitarians have such value hierarchies as well, and they claim that all people are intrinsically equal in worth. But here we run into a contradiction that they have not identified. If people exhibit different values, and if values are of different worth, then people must be of different worth. Egalitarians should admit that they do indeed judge people to be of different worth. For example, they believe that dictators are bad people. Then people must be of different worth. Egalitarians should admit that they do indeed judge people to be of different worth. For example, they believe that dictators are bad people. But if everyone is of equal worth, and we thus must ascribe the same values to all people, then what justification do we have for punishing or removing dictators? An obvious argument they might make is that anyone who violates the universal principles of human rights cannot appeal to equality to escape punishment. But as I have argued against the paradox of tolerance, to make an estoppel-style argument for universal rights is tautological. In this case, to say that universal rights should be restricted by universal rights is nonsense. In other words, to create a paradox of universal rights, assuming that equality is one of those rights. The only way around this is to conceive of universal duties, which must be prior to universal rights. Otherwise, we run into the aforementioned contradiction, i.e. equality of duties must be restricted by the equality of duties. But then we run into a problem, which is that to assign people universal duties has the prerequisite of people being equal in some way. Otherwise, there's no common source from a humanist perspective for duties to originate from, and thus we can only have duties that originate with specific people. Therefore, to even have effective duties or rights at all, they must either originate from a transcendent source or be unequal, or both. Now we will address the problems with racial equality. For an egalitarian, all races exist on an even playing field with respect to value. But when an egalitarian speaks morally of different races, he usually sorts them into categories of uneven value. For example, white people are typically blamed for some of the world's worst racial crimes, such as colonialism and slavery. They then argue that the legacy of these crimes has resulted in the modern-day deprivation of indigenous and enslaved peoples, and as such, that white people as a group must be held responsible in various ways. Now, attributing moral crimes to a certain race must indicate that the person in question views it as less valuable. People have value hierarchies, and they view violations of human rights very low in the hierarchy. If a people commit such violations, then they are being attributed as a whole that lower order value. If an egalitarian were to argue that they value all races equally, yet attribute this lower order value exclusively to one race, then they are engaging in a contradiction unless they also attribute to other groups lower order values in equal fashion. Of course, the egalitarian can respond by arguing that he doesn't endorse the concept of race, but rather is simply using it instrumentally to work toward dismantling oppressive social structures such as white power. And so it is against white power that he attributes this lower order value, not against white people. And yet this milieu tends to also argue that white people benefit universally from white power and thus are responsible for it. We need only to consider the vitriol that critical race theorists have for the apologetic white liberal. It is a de facto accusation that a whole race is in and of itself possessed of this lower order value, which is this benefiting from white power. Since the only criterion for being responsible for the destructive effects of whiteness is to benefit from it, all white people, regardless of social status, class, attitudes toward minorities, or other individual traits, are themselves responsible. This is a very sweeping claim that is being applied to an entire race. Egalitarians are therefore not consistent in claiming to have consistency in egalitarian values. Egalitarians say that all races are equal, but this is a vague and ambiguous statement. Nothing can be just generally equivalent. They have to be equivalent in specific things. So what exactly are egalitarians saying when they use this phrase? If we are speaking as though races were equal in characteristics, this is self-evidently false. Even if races had identical capacities, such as, say, ability at distance sprinting, since races differ in appearance vis-a-vis each other, they cannot be said to have identical characteristics otherwise, and therefore cannot be equal. But when egalitarians make this claim, usually it comes with a normative connotation, i.e. that we ought to treat all races equally. In other words, races may not have equal characteristics, but they are equal in another way. Consider that we have two races, and we declare that they ought to be treated equally. This means that the races, even though they are different, are equivalent in some third thing. We might call this dignity. Since races have equal dignity, there's no reason to treat them differently even if they are unequal in all other respects and characteristics. But as Alain de Benoit wrote in Beyond Human Rights, if everyone is equal in dignity, then dignity is meaningless. Dignity can only exist with respect to certain values, and as such, dignity cannot ever be universalized. If all people are equally dignified, then their dignity exists without respect to their personal qualities, and as such, that dignity cannot ever pertain to their qualities and thus has no meaning at all. To illustrate why, let's consider the concept of value. To say that two commodities are equal is basically to say the same thing as to say that two races are normatively equal. They share some third thing in which they can be equivalent, even if the two commodities are not identical. Now, a merchant doesn't care what actual kinds of products he is selling. That each product has a specific use value is irrelevant to him. As far as he is concerned, the fact that he has an original painting from Van Gogh doesn't titillate him any more than the fact that he has a cheap reproduction of a painting from Da Vinci. What matters to him is the possibility of actually selling these goods. So in other words, he only cares about value, the third thing. Everyone who has ever had experience selling products understands that the merchant alienates himself with respect to the qualities of his products. The experience would be far different if he had produced these products for his own use, or if he were a consumer who wants the use value of these goods, such as the bragging rights of owning an original Van Gogh. Then he would care about the actual characteristics of those products rather than an abstract third thing, their value. Thus, egalitarians who proclaim that all races are equal in dignity enter into a same psychic space as the merchant with respect to his own products. All people are reduced down to an abstraction that exists without respect for qualities, which becomes its own value sui generis. Just as this robs for the merchant any grandeur of the original Van Gogh painting, it robs the egalitarian of any true respect for the real persons who are of a given race. It is a similar alienation, and it is problematic for the same reason that the fetishization of value in general is problematic. Now we will address the problem with anti-discrimination. Egalitarians often argue that equality is equivalent with respect for diversity, but this cannot be true. In order to respect diversity, we must be able to actually discriminate, which means to detect and categorize differences. If we cannot categorize differences, then we cannot actually have respect for any real qualities, since they would all just be a homogeneous mass. Diversity would just be a distinction without a difference. Egalitarians would accuse me of equivocating on the term discrimination, because what they actually mean isn't the mental faculty of discrimination, but rather holding different value judgments on races and treating races differently. But by necessity, we do treat and judge different things differently. We treat our friends differently from strangers because we know our friends are going to value us more. We treat dogs differently from humans because we know that they have different needs and different means of communicating with us. We treat plants differently because we know that some will harm us and some will benefit us. Why race should have a special significance over all these other categories is something that egalitarians have to actually argue. They might say that racial discrimination has caused terrible atrocities and that other forms of discrimination have not, and as such, that there is benign and harmful discrimination, and that racial discrimination is necessarily harmful. But one could also argue that racial discrimination is itself conceptually neutral. There can be beneficial and harmful versions of racial discrimination. In the end, the only world in which we did not treat different things differently would be a world in which all things were the same, and thus could not have any different effects on us, or in which we'd have all the same effects on all other things. Therefore, to discriminate different races necessarily means that we must treat them differently. Lastly, we will discuss economic equality. Of course, the basis for the leftist argument that people ought to be economically equal is Marx, but as far as I'm aware, Marx didn't actually make an argument to justify his judgment against exploitation, which is the source of inequality. As I said in another video, the ethics of Marxism is just a black hole, and moreover, attempts to construct an ethics around Marxism in any definite way has been largely a failure. Despite that, leftists are some of the most moralistic people against capitalism and wealth inequality. They call the bourgeoisie parasites and exploiters and declare that the proletariat is oppressed and that the bourgeoisie are oppressors who must be overthrown. The issue is complicated because Marx didn't really speak much regarding what the specific attitude of the proletariat would have to be in order for class war to be carried out. He simply believed that the immiseration caused by exploitation would be in and of itself a sufficient catalyst for the revolution. The moral superstructure of the proletariat would basically take care of itself. But because Marx didn't elaborate on this superstructure, we run into a serious problem. Namely that in Marx, exploitation as a concept doesn't carry any moral significance at all, and as such, there is no reason why we should assume that the proletariat would be against exploiting others. We can easily imagine a society in which the proletariat, rather than overthrowing the bourgeoisie, simply exploits the bourgeoisie's centralization of capital to grant the proletariat the highest possible wages, or even a giant welfare state that allows them to live the opulent lives that were previously the prerogative of their oppressors. Conservatives would say that modern society in the West basically resembles this, that left liberals are voting for policies that are unfair to the bourgeoisie and middle class for the sole benefit of the working class. I'm not saying that this view is necessarily true right now, since what I have in mind here is a far extreme beyond a social safety net. What I'm basically saying is that Marxism, if we look at how labor actually behaves, would never get past the stage of social democracy and its reliance on the market. First of all, we have to consider that virtually every revolution in pre-modernity simply resulted in the reinstitution of domination in society just by the stock of the revolutionaries instead. We have the Baghdadi Rebellion, for example, which just resulted in the Baghdadi setting up their own instantiation of feudalism under their own control. Then we have the French Revolution, in which the bourgeoisie overthrew the nobility and simply instituted themselves and their values as dominant instead. In modernity, in basically every country that has ever had a meaningful labor movement, they have largely only acted in such a way as to raise wages and improve working conditions. Marx, however, thought that the proletariat would want to completely eliminate wage labor, which is the engine of exploitation. But why wouldn't the proletariat accept wages if they could be brought punishingly high enough through state policies against the bourgeoisie? Those who defend the market claim that capitalists perform an essential role by organizing the means of production, And if it's true that this is in fact a necessary component of the economy, then why wouldn't things turn out the way I have indicated? Now, those who are looking for a moral argument against Marx are looking in the wrong place. In fact, I would accuse those leftist moralizers against capital and domination that they have completely misread Marx, because Marx was expositing a scientific theory of how society would unfold. The reason why Marx doesn't justify his concept of exploitation is because he believed this exploitation would inevitably end due to the dialectical conflict of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie based on purely material relations. To criticize universal entitlement to equal wealth, then, we must criticize the actual theory of Marxism rather than to attempt to construct a moral critique of the idea. Because I think Marxism would just invert the relationship between the bourgeoisie and proletariat, I don't think that economic equality is a sound position. Additionally, we must consider that Marx cannot be called an egalitarian because his position was not that every person was entitled to absolutely equal wealth, but rather that people should have the appropriate amount of goods for their respective needs. In other words, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. This statement in and of itself implies an unevenness of both needs and abilities, and as such, the society that results would not be equal at all. Ultimately, egalitarianism, even if we ignore the utter lack of evidence for it in the natural world, is an untenable position. I haven't come across any genuinely good philosophical arguments in favor of it, and typically egalitarians only appeal to the consequences they believe egalitarianism would have, such as world peace, non-discrimination, and the elimination of poverty. But this is very much just begging the question rather than an actual argument in favor of it. Egalitarianism is completely baseless. It's simply a modern bigotry that refuses to go away.